Humans are way less important than we think we are. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time to plant one is today. Every time I walk out of my backyard, I see another plant that's died. What is there to be hopeful for? The planet will exist or it won't. We'll be part of it or we won't. And it breaks my heart because my garden is dying around me and I can do nothing about it because we have no water. Look, I think we're going to be living in a few different worlds in 10 years' time.
Rebel Black is a land steward, educator and founder of The Hungry Spirits, a regenerative hub based in Lightning Ridge, New South Wales. And she's working in one of the harshest, driest parts of Australia, and she's turning degraded soil into living systems and reimagining what rural resilience can look like. What I really find fascinating is that she doesn't think in 2-year plans, 5-year plans, but she thinks in 100, 200, 300-year plans. And I have the feeling that we need to do this a little bit more often in order to create a regenerative world. Rebel, welcome to the Food Forest podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you, Louis. It's lovely to be here.
You're from Australia. Can you tell me something that's typical Australian?
Typical Australian. I guess it depends where in Australia you are coming from. But I want to acknowledge that I'm here on Yuwalarai country, so the unceded territory of the First Nations people. Where I live is the Yuwalarai people. They would say yama in their language. That means hello.
Yama.
Yama, yeah. A typical Australian, we definitely use the word mate to greet friends. And I think that we like to not take ourselves too seriously most of the time.
Good.
We have a bit of a dry sense of humour, typically, especially those of us that live in rural and regional areas. But probably like in Europe, there's not a typical, that everyone's kind of doing themselves as best they can in a very fast-changing world.
Yeah. And I think it's natural that with the amount of precipitation you have, that you have a dry sense of humor, right? Sorry.
That is very true. Yes, we align with the landscape. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Australia has a lot of drought-prone places. Can you put that a bit in context for me?
Yeah, so I guess where I live is about 800 kilometres thereabouts from the ocean. So we're inland, but we're by no stretch of the imagination. We are inland centre of Australia. So there's still even a lot of country between us and the New South Wales border. So there's a huge amount of dryland areas in Australia, largely that are low average rainfall. So where I live, it's about 15 inches. I think that's about 600 mil. It's usually quite sporadic, and this varies in the dryland areas. But for us, usually it's hard to tell when we will get big rain, but when we do get rain, we usually get a lot all at once and then nothing for, maybe months. So
Wow, how many months?
Well, this year we had nearly 2 months without very much rain, maybe a few mils only. But then we've had more than our average rainfall already this year because we've had a very wet autumn. So an unseasonably wet autumn, I would say. And when I looked back over the records from the last few years, there is no average anymore. And I remember talking to one of the local people that are growing food in their backyard, but were farmers before they retired here, and they've been keeping records for 50 or 60 years, rainfall records in where they were in central West Queensland and then also here in Lightning Ridge. And he is saying for sure that there's no such thing as an average anymore. It's very difficult. There's very little consistency that he's seeing in the last probably decade or so.
Scary. The place around you is dryland. Has it always been dryland if you go back 100, 200, 300, 500 years?
Yeah, so obviously there's been human occupation in Australia. The numbers vary, somewhere between 10 and 100,000 years of human occupation, depending on whose records you're choosing to read at the time. And we know that the people have survived an ice age on this country. The fossil record that they find here in Lightning Ridge because of the opal miners. So Lightning Ridge, where I live, is they mine for black opal, which is a precious gemstone. And it's all small business owners. The miners all work for themselves. It's not big company mining. And those miners find opal, but they also find fossils that are opalized. And so they find fossils of dinosaurs, of plant material that indicate that 100 million years ago, this area was an estuarine system. So it was a forested system on the edge of what we know as the Great Artesian Basin. So it was essentially a wet lakeland kind of area. That's what the vegetation that they find in the fossil records. So somewhere between 100 million years and human occupation, this area was underwater or was near to large bodies of permanent water.
Yeah. You're around 600, 800 kilometers from the shore. A lot of theories, and I'm actually talking about the theory of the biotic pump, says that you can make it rain again and have clouds sucked in from the ocean until where you would live. Do you think that would be an option to recreate the biotic pump to make it rain more often and more stable?
Look, we've had this conversation many times with our Syntropic, workshop participants, and certainly with Tiago Barbosa, our Syntropic Agroforestry teacher, where we've wondered whether we could pull moisture from other places, other systems using forests. So whether we could plant forests in strategic locations of particular densities that would actually recreate a rain corridor. Because a lot of what's happened over the last sort of 100 to 150 years in this country and the country west of us is large-scale land clearing for agriculture, so for commodity-based agriculture. So there's been a lot of forests pulled down for cropping, and so we've speculated that has resulted in longer, drier seasons and longer, drier periods as a result. That is speculation, but can we bring the rain back? I like to think so, and it is part of one of the missions of our demonstration site here in Lightning Ridge, is to see if we can prove the model at a small scale and then hopefully find other farmers that have larger areas that we could actually start to strategically plant forests and see if it's possible.
Can you tell me more about what exactly you are doing with Syntropic Agroforestry and how you would see that you would create more rain? Could you tell the listener, because not everybody knows about how the biotic pump works exactly?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that where we live, most of our rain weather comes from across the inland. So if it's raining in Alice Springs, for example, which is basically in the middle of Australia, it's likely that we will also get rain. So the rain coming from Alice Springs is usually coming from the west coast, from activity offshore on the west coast of Western Australia. So it's coming large distances across vast stretches of arid and semi-arid land. So if we were to move water back into this landscape, it's likely we would be bringing it from that direction rather than from the eastern seaboard, although we do occasionally get systems that will come, that we will get the tail of a rain event that's coming from the east. But we've been growing a very small Syntropic Agroforestry demonstration site here on our property since 2020. We planted the first system in 2020, and as an experiment, because most of the Syntropic agroforestry in Australia had been done in the temperate zones on the eastern seaboard, so where they're getting reasonable rainfall and pretty frequent and consistent rainfall. So we didn't really know if it would work, and we didn't really know what plants would work and how we would kind of build the system, but we just planted what we could get our hands on, what we could get access to at the time, and thought we'd see what happened. And what we've seen happen is the methodology of Syntropic Agroforestry, which is really at its simplest term, looking at what the forest does in a natural system and replicating it in a system that can be sped up So where, nature might take hundreds or thousands of years to return to the forest from the desert, human intervention and, proper system management would mean you could speed that cycle up and have it happen much more quickly. So that's the theory. And so what we were looking at is how does that work in practice? And if we were to implement that here, what would the species be that would work well together? We're also looking at how do we regenerate land through the soil, obviously. So really for the first few years, we're encouraging the forest, or the forest is doing all the work to actually improve the soil with a view that we would then be able to grow more plants that would be maybe food-based that require a higher quality and quantity of life than our soil currently can manage because of where we want to eventually have food systems. That would be the ideal, because food security in these more remote communities is pretty risky because of the high transport costs and the large distances that food has to travel to get to these places. So to have some food resilience would be great, and to be able to prove a system that would enable the growth of, food in this semi-arid environment would be pretty amazing.
Definitely. And how would that create more rain, that type of food growing? What's the core principle behind that?
So I guess in his work in Brazil, Ernst Gott, who's the founder of the Syntropic Agroforestry movement, the thing that really got me excited about syntropic agroforestry as opposed to all the other ways of growing things that I'd been looking at for 20 years or more, really. I grew up on a farm, so I grew up in the early days of regenerative farming. My parents were early adopters in Australia, and so I've been around this my whole life. But Ernst's thing was that he brought rainfall back to the region with a 500 hectare reforested area. And we've also seen grassland type forestry happening in Australia, where landscapes have been rehydrated, creeks start running again, springs are reactivated, and more rain falls from the sky, where bare earth is being regenerated with grasses and trees and shrubs.
Are these projects documented that you're talking about?
Yeah, so there's a fantastic initiative in Australia called the Malloon Institute, and that's the work of a farmer that's been working in the tableland country in southern New South Wales, and they've been working in rehydration of landscapes for quite some years. Different methodology to syntropic agroforestry, but more of a grazing system, but they've got well-documented, good science behind a lot of the work that they're doing. And I would hope that over time, syntropics in agroforestry in Australia would be able to get to the point where that is happening as well. We've been really experimental in what we're doing here and haven't taken a scientific approach necessarily, because that's, I'm more of a big picture thinker. I'm like, let's just do it and see what happens. But the opportunity for more study and more research is absolutely there, because we've got a model that is working. And so it would be nice to sort of start a system from scratch with the knowledge that we've got, and sort of see the science around that as well.
Yeah. And you have about 600 millimeters of rain, sometimes 2 months without any rain. So you have to plant species that are adapted to dry conditions. Can you name me some species of the lower strata, the higher strata, the highest strata, so we can visualize what you're growing?
Sure. So the plants that we've seen work best, and admittedly our systems haven't seen a drought. They haven't been through an extended dry period yet, because we've had a few good years or a few decent years with rainfall. But what we're seeing growing really well in the systems is the saltbush, which is an endemic species in Australia and is quite the old man saltbush is quite a broad leaf, and it's growing really well.
Do you know the scientific name?
No, sorry.
Saltbush, okay, but people can Google it probably. All right.
People can Google it, yeah, saltbush. Old man saltbush is the species. We also grow what's called ruby saltbush. It's more of a and it's like a bush food as well. It has both are edible. The old man saltbush, you can eat the leaf. Ruby saltbush is more of a little shrub and not so much for biomass, but it has little berries on it that are quite sweet and delicious. They both very hardy, both drought tolerant. The old man saltbush we like particularly because it grows, it likes being cut back, so it really appreciates that chop and drop that the syntropic forestry method relies on, is human intervention to speed up the natural system. And so we get a lot of good biomass off the saltbush. It's also very good at, it seems to like playing, growing with other things. And that's always helpful in these syntropic systems because we're planting in very high density. We're trying to plant as many species together in a small area as we can. So that the saltbush is really key. The other two species that we're seeing really work effectively is the river red gum, and they are quite shallow rooted. So I'm not sure how they're going to go in the long term. We've already had one of those fall in the system because their roots are so shallow. That's what they are.
It's eucalyptus tree, right? The river red gum?
It's a eucalyptus. Yeah, the river red gum is a eucalypt. And it's growing really tall really quickly. We found that it grew, which means that it's also encouraging growth in all of the other trees. So that's a helpful thing. And we have also in that same strata the casuarina, which is less. So at least with the river red gum, we get some biomass from it. So it produces a decent amount of leaf. The casuarina is not so much for biomass, but for height. So it definitely likes to grow tall and straight. And that's a good thing, again, for getting height in the system and filling that cavity. We planted over 600 prickly pear in the first system, which in Australia is illegal, even though it's a staple, a food source in Mexico and other countries in the world. In Australia, it's considered a biosecurity risk because it got out of control. It's invasive. Yeah. So, but we now 5 years on, there's only probably half a dozen of those 600 left in the system. So we've kind of proven the thinking that once the soil improved and the cactus served its purpose, it would no longer live in the system. And that's really what we've seen. We've been able to manage the cactus out of the system, and the system has become inhospitable for it once its function served. So I was a bit nervous about that in the beginning, but we trusted the process, and it's definitely yielded because they offer great biomass. You can chop and drop them, and they build the nutrient in the soil. And
you can even bury the leaves.
Yeah, we just lay the leaves on the top of the tree lines, and they break down and they essentially kill themselves out. It's a little bit mean, but we use the biomass value of the cactus as a way of improving the soil, and then the improved soil means the cactus doesn't live there anymore because it doesn't like goods, that higher, richer quality soil.
Yeah, and the nice thing with prickly pear is you can. So first and for all, if depending on the climate you are, you can use it as like fences. But the fruit themselves, well, I've learned that the hard way. You have to really remove all the stings on it because I had like these stings in my mouth for 3 days. If you only leave like one and you eat it, so that's like a very important thing. But you can make so much nice syrups out of it, spreads, juices. It's so versatile and it's relatively easy in depending which situation. We're using the Casua. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Louis, there is a variety called the Indian fig, which isn't illegal to plant in Australia and has a smoother leaf and also a smoother fruit. So And there are other cactuses growing in this area. The names I do not know, but they're more of a fat, kind of those tall, fat ones that you would see more likely in the American desert, that they also have a large fruit on them that has no spines on it. So we also, like, the fruit is spine-free, prickle-free, so that they're a much more pleasant fruit to harvest and use. And they're also a much more pleasant, the Indian fig is a much more pleasant one to use because it has less spines on the leaf as well when you're chopping and dropping and planting.
Yeah, the casuarina, we're using it too because it's also a pretty hardy tree in Argentina on an island that we're regenerating. And the salt bush, the old man salt bush, the A triplex, we have them a lot at the Mediterranean region as well, and they're using it also for animals to graze on. So
yes,
it's a very versatile crop, and I personally really like it, and it's edible for humans too with the like very salty leaves. You don't have to add salt anymore to your salads.
yeah.
So
There's
nice.
in Australia they have, it's a high premium product, the saltbush lamb. Is, you know, highly sought after because the lamb has that kind of flavor of the saltbush already in the meat.
It's they have it as well in Europe and some places where the lambs they graze near the sea and eat this salty grass. So it's very prized. The winters, how do they look like at your
The winters can get cold. We get a few, cold for us anyway, not cold by European standards, or even by other parts of Australia, but we will get, probably on our site, we would end up with maybe 6 to 10 frosts in a year where we're getting, you know, sub-zero temperatures overnight. But mostly the daytimes range kind of between 15 and 23 or 24 degrees. And we get, you know, 5 degree overnight. So it does get quite cold. Our summers usually we'll get at least a week or two over 45 degrees Celsius and then creeping up over 50 degrees. Sometimes in February we'll get a week to 10 days over 50, which is pretty hot.
Wow, that's that is really hot. Do you grow any nuts?
Look, we haven't actually had any success with nuts yet, but we haven't planted them at the beginning of a system. We've only retrofitted them into existing systems. I was hoping that in August, our next workshop, we would be able to plant some pistachios because our research suggests that pistachios would probably be the best fit for this climate, but that will depend on availability of stock and whether I can get any trees at that time, which is looking unlikely at the moment. So we might have to change our planting cycle to try and get a nut tree into a system.
Yeah. And would it be correct your Köppen climate zone is like hot semi-arid, right? Is that correct?
Yep, correct.
Yeah. So if people want to try it in Europe or United States, in Europe it's probably like Murcia, Almeria, Athens, Greece, and in the United States more like West Texas, Eastern California, Southern Arizona, maybe the Oklahoma Panhandle, Western Kansas a little bit.
Yeah,
would that be correct?
Absolutely.
Approximately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we do find the more Mediterranean type foods like olives. Our olive trees are growing really well. We've got pomegranates that are going quite well now, and figs also growing quite well. In one of our systems, we've got a bit of a Mediterranean zone going where we've got the medjool dates, the olives, the pomegranate and the fig all growing together, and that seems to be going quite well. So I think that more Mediterranean climate produce is going to be what works best here. Having said that, we also have citrus. We've got like kaffir limes growing really well. We've got a Maya lemon. We have had mango. We've picked a couple of mangoes off one tree that survived before we knew about syntropics.
That's
But
cool.
I think we wouldn't try mangoes again for a little while until the soil improves. It's mangoes and avocados, but I do think we'll be able to get them to grow in the system.
That would be just amazing. You have founded a farm. It's called The Hungry Spirits. Can you tell me where that name comes from and also the journey you made to go from growing up on a farm and then having a life journey and then to end up at the Hungry Spirits? What were your biggest, say, milestones in your personal transformation in order to get there?
Well, when I was 8 years old, I came home with a T-shirt that was printed that I'd been at a school camp, and there was we were printing T-shirts as part of it, and I did a T-shirt that said "More trees, more life." I was growing up on a farm, and I'm pretty sure there was a beautiful woman there, a teacher who was probably a bit of a hippie, and so she was possibly encouraging us, but we definitely, it was something I believed in. And I walked in the door at my coming home after this camp with
Love
my
it.
More Trees, More Life t-shirt, which I've actually reproduced, and we're now looking at a merchandise range. But
Oh,
I was
love it.
like, I walked in the door and my grandfather just said, why more trees, more life? And I couldn't really answer him, but I think at that age 8, we were learning a lot about the hole in the ozone layer and the need for carbon dioxide to be taken out of the atmosphere. That was kind of my remembrance of that. And at the time, we were probably pulling trees down on our farm for more cropping. So I guess Pa was curious about where I got this thinking from, and he said to me, if you're going to take a stand for something, you have to know why you're taking a stand for it. You have to be able to answer when someone asks you, why do you take that
Fair
stand?
enough.
And it was good advice, it was really good
Yeah.
advice. So my parents later, many years later after that, got involved in regenerative agriculture and got into cell grazing and building no-till and minimum till machines for planting. And we certainly replanted a lot of trees. So I guess I grew up in that, living on the edge of a conservative perspective and an old school farming perspective, and then that more modern generation of my parents coming through as more modern farmers and looking to what else was possible. My parents sold the farm more than 30 years ago now, but I ended up here in Lightning Ridge living on a 1 acre block with my husband that's right on the edge of the opal field. So it's a really tiny patch of land. We were discouraged from coming back to the farm because it was financially a challenging career path. My parents perceived that, and so they wanted something different for us. So we were encouraged off farm. And so I never really thought to become a farmer or get involved in agriculture at all, to be honest, even though I loved it and it was part of my DNA and a big part of my growing up.
So what did you do? What did you do then in that time between? Were you a city
Well,
girl?
I moved to the city for a couple of years and studied law and psychology and politics. And then I hated university, so I left and I went and I worked on a cattle station in Central Australia. And then I ended up taking a real job here in Lightning Ridge as the editor of the newspaper. So I had like a really short window of this whirlwind adventure of kind of don't know what I want to do. No, I don't know exactly what I don't want to do once I've done it. And then ended up in journalism, which I'd always been encouraged, as a good writer. And so I'd been encouraged in that space. And so I found myself as the editor of the newspaper here, covering stories on all sorts of interesting and different things, and always retaining my connection to agriculture and, the people that are living on the land and living in rural regional Australia through the media. And then I really started running my own businesses. So when you live in a little town with a population of a question mark, when you drive into town, that's 2.5, maybe 5,000 people at the most. You've got to be pretty creative and innovative. There aren't many real jobs here for, career-oriented people once you've reached the top of your game. My very first job in the news industry was as the editor of the newspaper. In Lightning Ridge, there's not many places to go up from there. So you've kind of got to go sideways into your own thing. So, my husband and I built a restaurant on our property on the Opal Fields, and I've run a consulting business really for the last 20 years. That's very, iterated I started a business that I then sold to a cooperative that I co-founded that supports 100,000 rural women in Australia through programs and activity, does a lot of advocacy work. And so just, taken the skills that I've learned in my career development, and I just keep evolving them into new spaces, but always with the view that I wanted to advocate and champion, make a difference in the lives of rural and regional people, particularly in Australia. Yeah, a few years ago, a friend and I were workshopping, what is it, who are we, what do we do? We were having these conversations, and I realized my mission in life was to bloom where I am. And that my mission, therefore, was to inspire and support other people to bloom where they were as well. I don't care where they are. I don't care how they do it, as long as they're blooming, as long as they are living in their best version of themselves. And knowing that when you do that, there's a positive impact and a positive ripple that comes as a result of that. My blooming is so supportive of other people's in a whole range of different ways. And so, yeah, that's the mission, to bloom where I am and to inspire and support others to do the same. And the way that I do that changes, all the time, because I'm curious by nature, and I've got a lot of interests and a lot of passions. And I had someone describe it as a portfolio lifestyle, and I think that's a really good way of describing my life. I've got clients that are high net worth individuals that I provide delivery partnership and consulting support to. And I also make the beds and clean the toilet for our little caravan Airbnb on our property here in Lightning Ridge. So,
What a beautiful combination.
Yeah, I get to do a whole range of different things and make a difference in a lot of spaces.
What you're describing is something that a lot of people dream about.
Yeah.
Is that something that came very natural to you? Was it hard for you at the first time to do it? What would you advise people who hear your story and are super inspired and say, oh my God, that's exactly what I want to do, but I'm stuck, I'm afraid, I don't know how to start, analysis paralysis? What would you tell them?
Look, I think I am an optimist and I'm also an opportunist. And I think some of that's like coding, it's almost in my DNA. It's almost at a cellular level that's part of my nature. But I think that from a young age, I trusted my own intuition. And I had lots of experiences and environments that attempted to pull me away from that intuitive knowing. But for some reason, I just had the courage to quit those things despite resistance and pushback from important, wise and valuable people in my life, and just say, no, this is the right thing for me. And even though it makes no sense to you, and maybe it doesn't even make sense to me, I cannot ignore this impulse.
That intuition.
I would refer to it in my young years as like the universe. The universe is guiding me. And I remember saying this to my mum, and she just thought I was mad. Now we talk about the universe all the time. Like, mum's the biggest proponent of the universe ever. And I think I was lucky that I had enough support in my life that even though people were disappointed or disagreed with my decisions, they still loved me and cared for me and supported me anyway. And then they realized Rebel's just going to do that anyway, so we might as well just get on board, and we'll never know what adventure's coming next. So I think you've got to have courage. I think you've got to cultivate high degrees of courage, and you've got to really get good at knowing yourself and knowing what your own discernment is around the intuitive ability. Like, is this intuition, or is this my ego, or is this someone else's narrative that I've
or yourself being afraid? Maybe that could,
or my fear
as well.
Yeah.
Well, was it an emotional journey too, to start transforming your land at your farm? What kind of emotional paths did you cross?
Yeah. Well, my husband and I have always grown our own food here, and that was really inspired by my grandfather who, growing up on the property, my grandfather always tended to our veggie patch. So I grew up eating food that was grown in the backyard as pretty normal standard practice. And so I watched him and learned from him. And so it was sort of, and Michael had similar, he had family members involved in growing food. So it was sort of a natural thing for us to start growing our own food, even though the ground is like concrete and we get very little rain. We just had that inside ourselves to be like, we want to grow our own food. And we think we can. And we think we should try at least, even though the odds are stacked against us to do that. So we encouraged each other, and my husband's very resourceful. He's very practical. He's a welder and he can move and make anything. So we're like, one night we just cleared the land where we were, a little patch of land. All night we're just raking gravel under the spotlights in the summer. And we just started laying down tires. We'd collected all these old tires. And so we just started laying down tires and putting dirt that he'd gone and got from the edge of the old, the dry lake bed. And we just filled the tires up. We painted the tops of them white so they might reflect a little bit of the hard sunlight and not be so hot. And we just started growing food, and we built some shade, and from there
In the tires.
in the tires on the top.
You're not afraid of the leaching chemicals of the tires?
I mean, at the time it was like, we need a container. It was free. It made sense. There was a hole in the middle. We could fill it up and we could see what happened. And yeah, we grew an amazing garden for years in tires.
Sometimes you just have to take the things you can find, right?
You've got to start with what you've got. And then, of course, we're like, maybe the tires aren't working so well. We want to grow a bigger area. The edge grew. We're always pushing. Well, I'm always pushing the edges. I'm like, now can we grow it a little bit bigger? And now can we grow it a bit bigger? And I'm always learning. And so, but I think so we'd always been growing like this. And really it's the hard way, because I'm trying to grow the way my grandfather grew, but it's a totally different environment to where I grew up, and we didn't have as much time, and all the things you learn along the way, like we have to water a lot, and shade cloth, which is great in summer, but then there's seasons where you don't want shade cloth because you need a bit more to get more prolific growth. There's lots of variables. We've tried and failed so many things, and then I saw a video called Return to Eden on, I think it was on Vimeo at the time, and I watched this guy just talking about how he looked at the forest, and the forest was like just growing itself, and here was him doing all this hard labor and not getting anywhere near the output that the forest was getting. And I was like, I kind of feel like this, I'm feeling you here. We work really hard for this garden, and maybe there's an easier way. And that just started me thinking a little differently, looking at my landscape a little differently. And then I was in a meeting in a nearby town during the worst drought. So we had 7 years of below average rainfall back to back, and even the smartest, most resilient farmers were going to the wall. The suicides, people walking off farm, people, in generational farms having to sell out or walk away and leave it. And
wow.
I was in this meeting and everyone's saying, what do we do about the drought? And these farmers stood up and said, the best way we can solve the drought is to let us pull over more trees so we can clear more country, so that we can grow bigger crops when we get good seasons. And the seasons out here are really, you'll get 3 good seasons in 10, where you're going to get a decent crop, and the other 7 years you might get a crop and you might not. So it's more variable. And everyone stood up and clapped. And I thought, if they haven't figured out that there is more drought and longer dry periods because there are less trees, we're in real trouble here, because everybody gave them a standing ovation. And I was just so distressed when I left that meeting. I understand what they were saying. I understand the thinking behind it, but I just thought it's such short-sighted thinking. And then I thought, well, what can I do? I'm just like a nobody. I'm not a farmer. I've been a long time off any agricultural connection, and I live on a little tiny block where I just grow a few veggies. What can I do? I felt powerless. That was the emotion, was just that real sense of powerless and just sad. I felt so sad that this was the only solution we could come up with. as a community was to just kill the land some more, you know?
And how did you deal with those emotions?
Well, like I raged a bit at the people in my own inner circle about it, I just couldn't believe it. And then I guess my intuition went to work, the bigger part of me that knows we're on a path. And I got called, I got that intuitive call to go to a workshop on the Gold Coast. And I met Tiago, Barbosa, who is our Syntropic teacher. I met him and I said to him, what do you do? And he said, I teach people to plant water. And I said, well, you better come to Lightning Ridge then, because we haven't had rain in 7 years and they're going to pull more trees over to solve the drought. And that the rest is history, really. But to me, it's, clear the emotions, like get clear with what your emotions are, and then look at your circles of control. What do I have control over and influence over? And start there, because there's a whole lot of other stuff that I cannot control, including what other people do with their own land.
Yeah, so you had your emotions, and these
Yeah.
emotions actually kickstarted you to get into action and see, okay, there's a lot of things I cannot change, but what can I change? Myself, my own plot of land, and then maybe, who knows, it will spread out.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't looking to do that. I didn't go searching for the way. I didn't go searching for the solution. I guess I held the question with curiosity around, well, what can I do? What can I do? And I didn't have the answer. But then when I met Tiago, I knew that was the next thing to do. I just knew, right, okay, well, you better come. And then he knew that too. He knew he'd better come as well, because he's following his intuitive path to Syntropic Agroforestry. And so, together we know. And then, of course, over the last 5 years, we've also met hundreds of other people. And now, because of the YouTube videos, that we've got tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of other people who are also feeling that intuitive call to do something a little different and to make, to find their circle of control and do what they can within that to make the difference so that they can.
You call yourself the human agronomist. What does that mean exactly?
Well, agronomy is the study of plants, and connecting the agronomist's role in plants is to find out what's helping the plant thrive and get it connected to it, and what's stopping the plant from thriving and getting it connected to it. And I do that with people. I do it with people and places, communities. And so, yeah, I've got a skill and an ability to be able to meet people and get a sense of what it is that they might need, and then whether I provide it or whether I connect them to the network that, the mitochondrial kind of network of humans. I've got a pretty big one now, and, I can connect them to that sort of what next step for them might be that's going to help them thrive in their environment.
In your workshop and gatherings, you include grief work, embodiment, and storytelling. How, especially the grief work and embodiment, how can I imagine this?
The best example I can give you is very often that's not explicit. It's not explicit that we're doing that. I mean, we've run retreats here where that is explicit, where it's like that's what the people, and mostly women, we've worked with mostly women, come for that. There was this during the drought, so somewhere between 2017 or 14, 15 and 2019. We ran a workshop. It was a no-dig workshop, so learning how to grow soil above the ground, because we live in such hard soil conditions. That's an easier way to get started. And this group of people came, and a lot of them were from quite a distance away. And this one woman came from probably 4 or 5 hours she'd driven to come to this workshop for the day. And we sat in a circle, everyone introduces themselves, they share a bit about themselves. When you do that in nature, in an outdoor kind of setting, people tend to get quite honest and quite vulnerable, because it feels safe for them to do that. And this woman sat next to, we were sitting near our mulberry tree, and this woman shared the story. She said, I didn't really know why I came to this workshop at all, but I just knew that I had to come. And she said, even sitting in this circle hearing, maybe she was halfway in the circle, just already hearing a few of your stories. She said, I already got what I came for. I really came for the connection, because she said every time I
Wow.
walk out, of my backyard, I see another plant that's died, and it breaks my heart because my garden is dying around me and I can do nothing about it because we have no water. And for people that live on farms, where they'll very often, the garden in their farmland will be the last sanctuary, because everything else out there has died. The ground is bare, there's not a leaf, but they'll keep their farming, their little house farm garden as their priority. But she'd even run out of water to water it.
Oh my God.
And so she tells this story, and everyone's really moved, and there's lots of tears, and everyone gets lots of hugs. And everyone's like, damn, I thought I came here to learn how to put some straw in the ground and plant a seed or two, and now we're like telling our life stories, and we're connecting with humans. And
Yeah.
so that's a beautiful thing that just sort of happens organically. But the amazing part of that, Louis, and why it becomes a bigger part of our intention, is that 2 days after that workshop finished, I went outside and I looked at I walked past the mulberry tree, and the branch next to where she had been sitting was covered in leaves, and every other branch was still in a dormant phase, because it was like it was autumn or winter. But
That's
but where
intense.
she had been sitting, the leaves had all come back on that one branch. And I was like,
Incredible.
this is amazing. Like, this is where that sort of energetic
Unbelievable.
exchange,
Yeah.
yeah, where healing is transferred. Maybe the
Yeah.
land healed her and the tree healed her. Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe there was reciprocity in it, but it certainly brought something to life in that plant that was not there before and was not there for
Wow.
other counterparts. And to me, that was like a moment in my own journey of realizing just how powerful intention was, how powerful connection is, and that it's not just humans that are participating in that experience.
That's so amazing, and I'm so glad to hear that. And so when I was starting out by giving food forest courses, like 2 times a year we give this, or more, we give this food forest courses where people come for 1 week. First, I thought, well, it's about sharing food forest knowledge, right? It's syntropic
Yeah.
agriculture, agroforestry, food forestry. But then before you knew it, and it's also, like you say, a very intuitive thing, connect people to a point where like you say, are sharing life stories, start to cry because they come in contact with such a deep part of themselves, to a point where in the beginning I was a bit afraid of that, because I grew up in a place where you had to be very rational and there's not a lot of space for intuition, stuff like that. And so I was like, ooh, well, other people maybe find this strange, but now I'm like, screw that. Let's just happen what's gonna happen, and it's so nice that it's like, well, oh, so you think you came to a food forest workshop? Think again. So yeah, it's so beautiful to see that it's all connected. It's about healing the soil, but also healing the soul. And I'm wondering, how has your own personal healing journey influenced the way you teach and lead others?
It's the only way I can teach others is through my own lived experience. That's the only thing I have authority to speak about, really. Other people that I've worked with, it's their journeys to tell their story. But I think I knew when I moved to Lightning Ridge, I was a very wounded young woman, very capable, very competent, and definitely intuitive, but I was still deeply wounded from life experiences that I hadn't really come to terms with or understood. So this place held me, but I was also repelled from it for a long time, in the sense that I traveled a lot away from here, because there's quite an intense energy here if you let yourself be kind of held by it. We've got deep ancient waters, there's the fossils and the opals in the ground. It's a very interesting agriculture. There was obviously the First Nations influence. There's a lot of incredible evidence in this region of First Nations, Indigenous forestry happening in this region. So there's a lot going on, and if you don't understand that and how you can harness that or cultivate it or what it even is, it can be a lot. So I found myself traveling a lot away from here, and then realized oh, there's something in that you need to pay attention to, and what is it that you're kind of avoiding or resisting. I mean, I've been to over 120 different healing practitioners myself. I've studied over 10 modalities. Work on myself first, always. If there's something coming up that I'm seeing with my clients or in community, I do the work for myself first. And I don't know why, it's just how I've done it. I'm like, be my own guinea pig and not teach something that I haven't been through or experienced myself as well. And I guess it's just a personal rule that I've held. And so my own healing journey informs a lot of the work that I do in all the fields that I work in. And I feel like the forest is that incarnate as well. It's like we're incubators of big ideas and possibilities and edge dwelling work. We live on the edge of the outback. This is it's an edgy place in geographic terms, in people terms, in the way that the people that are attracted here are quite edge fringe dwellers. And so to practice before you preach, to me, is a big part of my own personal ideology. And I think the syntropic forests that we're doing is that in practice. It's like, let's see what we can figure out and work and see what works, and then show people as we go, so that we can at some point teach for sure what we know will and can happen.
You often speak in long regenerative timelines, 30, 50, 100 years, maybe even more. If we follow this path and keep on thinking this long term, what kind of world might we be living in 10 years from now?
Look, I think we're going to be living in a few different worlds in 10 years' time. I think there's people that think like you and I do, and the many other people in the regenerative community that will carve one path, and that is, deep time, coming back to traditional practices, coming back to community, very relational in nature. And I think there is also a large cohort of people, and they're probably the more obvious ones, on the planet, that are thinking of a very different, more extractive model. It'll be interesting to see which one dominates. I think the two will somehow live together. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I think we've got to, for me, I'm paying attention to what's going on in the big picture, and then I'm just planting trees.
What gives you hope? What gives you hope in times of collapse, climate crisis, uncertainty?
Look, what gives me hope is the sense that humans are way less important than we think we are in this whole thing. There's a sense that there's a much bigger architect at play that we think we've got power over, and we just don't. Humans do not hold dominion. And so what gives me hope is that, what is there to be hopeful for? The planet will exist or it won't. We'll be part of it or we won't. What I'm interested in is, what can I control today? I control how I feel. I can have influence over how I feel and what I do about how I feel, and what skills can be that I've developed can be of highest service to what I'm compelled to be of highest service to, what my intuitive kind of drag is. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's passed away now, but she was an Indigenous leader here in Australia, and she said to me, "Oh, you white people, you're so, you're so worried about things." She said, why? We've been around 60, 100,000 years. We're still here. We think in a very short term. Most of us are conditioned to think in a very short term environment of our own lifetimes. But the Indigenous ways around the world are not. They're 7-generation thinking and more. And she was a historian. She looked at the world through the lens of her culture, her people, of that long time, deep time perspective. And it's like, yes, she was an activist, she was an activist through and through. So it wasn't that she was sitting around telling people what, don't worry about it. She was skin in the game doing stuff at a human level. But she also understood that most of it doesn't matter, actually, because whether you do or you don't, it's going to carry on without you.
Is this
with you or without you, it's going to carry on.
Yeah, you can say, well, don't worry, but also be an activist and try to change stuff at the same time. It's a good combo.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, yeah, it's a spiritual teaching. It's a spiritual teaching, I think, that is echoed by other spiritual teachers that I've learned from. She would not have seen herself as a spiritual teacher. She was a very pragmatic person, but to me, it was a spiritual teaching that says you're here and you're now, and your lifespan will be somewhere between 0 and 120 years. It's been here for a lot longer than that, and it's going to be here for a lot longer after that. And if you think you've got any actual control over that, you are deluding yourself.
Yeah, it's a good way to feel a little bit more at ease. Before we're gonna wrap up this podcast, I have two more questions for you. If you could pass on just one principle or story to the next generation of land stewards, would that be?
Look, I think it's the Chinese proverb that's the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time to plant one is today. I think we get overwhelmed with our disillusionment that we didn't do something when we should have, by ever what standard we've measured that should. And so I think it's like, rather than being consumed by your disillusionment and by your disappointment in your own inaction, is just do something today. Take that small step. Every small step, every small action leads at some point to a bigger habit or a new behavior or a different outcome at some point. And that's, again, that old Asian, the proverb from maybe China of, chop the wood, carry the water, I think is really true when you're talking about stewardship of anything, whether it's of land, of community, of family, of, parentage. Is all you can do is your best, and you can only do your best with what you've got today. And it's likely that hopefully you'll know better tomorrow, and then maybe you'll do better. So, but don't beat up on yourself, and don't not do something because you didn't do it last year or 10 years ago when you should have.
Yeah. My last question for you: when you would have a magic wand and you could change everything you want, everything is possible on a large scale or on a small scale, what would the first thing be you would do with your magic wand made from beautiful trees?
I would recode humans with the belief that they are enough.
Wow.
In and of themselves, here and now, they are enough. I think so much of the fear-based decision-making that we see and the extraction ecology that has been colonization, patriarchy, et cetera, comes from a lack of self-worth, fundamental lack of self-worth in an individual that then becomes a movement because they're convincing. And I figured that myself a long time ago, was that if I could recode myself with the belief that I was enough, then I would be okay no matter what. And I think that if I could recode humanity, that would be the number one primary belief. And I think if everyone held that as their seed, we would be facing very different planetary circumstances.
What a nice words to end this podcast, and it really also resonates with me. It's so true. Once you feel or have that feeling that you're enough, everything is fine. You're in harmony. There is no conflict. So I hope my listener will really have enjoyed definitely that last takeaway and our entire conversation, of course. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Food Forest podcast. Really hope to see you again next week with another incredible guest. This was Rebel Black. Thank you so much for tuning in all the way from Australia. And if you want to read the show notes, want to learn more about what she's doing, check out the show notes and more information on foodforestpodcast.com. And then I'll see you next week. Au revoir. Ciao, ciao.